This is a fantastic film to talk about. I've had a lot of fun trying to unpack it. If you haven't seen it, it's about 20 minutes long, and I definitely recommend coming back or later this evening giving it a view because it is a very rich, very textured work that is really exciting to get into. And it's a great film for the context. The Mistake Room is such a great place to learn about artists that you've never heard of. And usually the artists speak about things that you rarely see anywhere else, things that desperately need to be aired, need to be viewed. And so you see things here that are such full of fun and rigor, and this video is definitely in that spirit. I'm going to apologize in advance. There's a lot of very tough Polish names in this lecture. I'm going to do my best, but I should get started. So as a basic premise of this video, Future Days, Agnieszka Polska has imagined a sort of artist afterlife, populated by figures that are lost. And what I mean by lost is that they either vanished literally in terms of an artist like Bas van Adder, or left the art world for whatever reason. There are also characters in this film where the internal logic of how they think about art and where they think art is going naturally leads them to some sort of border or some sort of limit, a limit to which they cannot go forward. There's a lot of sadness in this film, a lot of thwarted desire, a lot of unfulfilled missions. And the film itself, in a way, is the fulfillment of what a lot of these artists were trying to do. So to imagine this film as a whole, these artists are wandering an island off the coast of Sweden. And through the course of wandering this island, they encounter various historical figures and various artworks. And it's very poignant and quite unsettling that the artworks become obstacles. Sometimes they're shelters, sometimes they're hindrances to the progress of these artists as they're journeying across this very stark landscape. I want to introduce them briefly. I'm not going to introduce the Americans and Bas van Adder because they're very well known, but I will point them out. The lady in the long hair to the left is Lee Lozano, who a lot of people I'm sure know very well, an artist who famously left the art world and made it into an artwork called The Dropout Piece. To the far right, who we'll see later in the video, is Paul Tech, subject of a very stellar retrospective at the Hammer some years back. And the gentleman to the right of Lee is Bas van Adder, who they have found alive on this island, which I'll explain a little bit later. The other three figures in the film are perhaps they're not obscure in Poland, but they're very obscure here. It was very challenging to get to know these characters. The one with the most substantial voice in the film is the lady on the right. Her name is very difficult. Her name is Charlotte Posenski. What she did with her career resonates with a lot of strategies that we found on our side of the world in America in the 70s. She was dedicated to an art practice that made sculptures at cost. So she had an industrial design background and she wanted to sell her sculptures for what they cost her to make. She ran up against a lot of resistance to this, and despite her best efforts, her artwork continued to gain in value and became, as artworks do, inaccessible to the very public she wanted them to be accessible to. So she left the art world entirely and became a sociologist, went back to school, continued to make artwork, but sociology was her primary intention. To her left is a gentleman named Jerzy Ludwinski. He was a theorist in Poland, and his ideas basically revolve around the fact that art logically at a point becomes very hard to distinguish from ordinary reality. He saw artwork as opening itself up to realms that it typically was merely a representation of. For instance, he saw around him art becoming politics, art becoming activism, art becoming theater, art becoming film. The traditional way of thinking about it as painting and sculpture inside of gallery and museum contexts, for him became irrelevant in a way. And he saw any traditional notions of art sort of dissolve right in front of his eyes. To his left is another figure sort of in the same line. His name is Borowski Wozimet. This one's very tough. In fact, it's so tough, I'm going to skip it. But he was along the same lines. He led various artist collectives in Poland that were specifically focused around the narrative of the end of painting, bringing certain threads of art making to their terminus, to where they would disappear. So this is our cast of characters in this film. Would you mind turning this next slide? So as these people proceed through the island, they meet this character. His name is Andrzej Zimsik, and he's quite obscure. I have to warn you, he's going to be the tragedy of this lecture. As these artists proceed through the island and find various paths through a tradition of artwork, this is the character who decides not to go with them, that he is not going to follow these characters through this landscape, through this afterlife. And what is very poignant about this is that the structure of this film is a structure that this artist would have recognized, would have loved. His basic premise of making artwork was that originality was not only was not, as it's traditionally known, as difficult. To him, that was the easiest way of making art. For him, the harder mission was understanding the past and repeating it in such a manner to where you occupy positions and you occupy sort of aesthetic frameworks where you have a voice, but the voice ceases to be you. You lose your subject, you lose yourself. He took this to a very mystical level, had an existence in Poland as almost like a monk. One interesting project that he did was he would make artwork out of children's coloring books. He would color in the coloring books, forfeiting his authorship in service of a mold that already existed. He would translate books into symbols. He would reconstruct entire libraries out of wooden blocks covered in lead. I really want to know a lot more about this person. It's very hard to know much about him, but we'll get to know him a little bit better, deeper into the talk. Do we have the next slide? So the way that Polska, the filmmaker, describes this afterlife, she's described it as being a sort of vision of heaven. And I know that it's dangerous to disagree with an artist because they have the intention behind the work. But I have a very hard time believing that this space that we're going to get to know has anything to do with heaven. This is a very tortured landscape, as we'll come to see. And in thinking about this, it became, for me, to resemble less heaven than some form of unfulfilled existence. I do not want to call it hell, because I don't think this place is hell. As you will see in the film, these people are fond of dialoguing with each other. It's kind of a utopia of discourse. It's kind of a utopia of conversation. But there's this undercurrent of unfulfillment. There's this undercurrent that's left over from their lives, left over from their various departures in their own practices. So I can't help but see this as limbo, as a place that's in hell, but a place where virtuous people reside forever unfulfilled. When Dante encounters Limbo outside, in the Inferno, the people in Limbo are figures like Cicero, Plato, Virgil, his guide, lives in Limbo, Seneca. These are who Dante describes as the sinless virtuous, people that did not believe in nor were capable, because they came very before, of seeing or latching into a Christian universe. But in and of themselves, they logically achieved virtue in their lives. And that's what I'm going to see this island as. I'm going to see this island as a sort of limbo. My two favorite versions of Limbo, Robert Rauschenberg's transfer drawings from 1958 on the left, shows Limbo as a series of Roman busts. You have the Arch of Constantine at the top, which is going to represent the entrance to the city of Dis. And to the right, Gustave Doré's great illustrations of Dante from the 18th century. We have the next slide. There's a lot of Christian influences in this film. And one thing that, if you read a lot of Polish literature, especially Polish poetry, there's something about Poland where they have very little trouble, and they're not shy about folding their tradition as a Catholic nation into their artwork, into their poetry. And the same is true in this video. You see a lot of references to the cross, Charlotte, when she's trying to convince Zimsik to go with them, she asks him to take up his cross and follow her, which are words right out of Jesus' mouth from the Gospels. And there's also a scene midway through the film that's very curious. The group as a whole is navigating over a river. And in their navigation, they're kind of on a rickety log that's sort of precarious. And they're followed by a woman in white. At first, I thought this, since we were thinking about Dante, that this could be Beatrice from the Inferno, Purgatorio, the Divine Comedy. But then I remembered a little Catholic card that my grandmother gave me when I was a kid, something that you would see in the back of a Catholic church pinned on a little cork board. To anyone that was raised Catholic, this is a very recognizable image of a guardian angel. And I think that Polska is mimicking this card in a way in this film. And this character who appears and then vanishes is almost kind of like a lost path in this film. She evaporates instantly, the angel that was unable to continue with her job. And so when I remembered my little prayer card from when I was a kid, it really came back with a lot of power in this film. I also add another representation of an angel from Wings of Desire, Wim Wenders' great film from 1987. I include this as sort of a starting point for a lot of images that are going to pop up in this lecture, which I'll explain in a moment. Can we have the next slide? So essentially, this film is a ghost story. This film is populated by figures that are dead. And these figures are allowed to reanimate and have voices in a new way. Typically in visual art, it is difficult to convey the fullness of a ghost. It's very hard to think about a ghost in visual art because you're sort of confined to representation. A ghost is so much more than something you encounter as a physical being. Of course, we see that in movies, but the strength of film and the strength of the media that Polska's using is that her ghosts actually are allowed to reanimate their voices. They're allowed to talk. And this gives this video a lot of kinship with ghosts emerging in other genres, specifically music and poetry. And I wanted to distinguish, as we start to go forward through the actual terrain of the island, between a ghost encounter and what I'm going to describe as possession. Here, a work of art that we actually have at the Broad Museum, Jeff Wall's Dead Troops Talking from the mid-90s. This is an example of an encounter with ghosts representationally. These Russian soldiers come in three different fashions. Either they are dead, they are dying, or they have already died and come back to life. What's extraordinary about this piece is Jeff Wall is able to distinguish these three different modes within a single photograph. At the same time, he's reviving certain ways of making art from the past. For instance, the direct reference is Roger Fenton's photos from the Crimean War from the mid-18th century. But I want to use this as a type of foil to what Polska's doing, which is much more expansive and much more elaborate. Can we have the next slide? One of Polska's earlier films is this floating mouth. And what she's trying to do in this, which is called The Mouth Number 2, what she's trying to do is get at a scientific principle where sound, we've all felt this, where you hear a sound and it sort of tingles you in the back of your neck. She's trying to mimic that in this film. But the more important reference here, and this is what I want to propose as sort of an account of possession in this film, is that the clearer reference is to Samuel Beckett's fantastic play, Not I. So this play by Beckett imagines a floating mouth, which in the Stan Brakhage version on the right is the mouth of Julianne Moore. But the fact is, it doesn't matter who the person is. It doesn't matter what the mouth is. In this Beckett play, the subject is entirely disconnected from the content. Beckett is imagining a series of voices, none of which are original, floating in the atmosphere and attaching themselves to mouths at given points. And so with this Beckett play, you have the idea of a completely disembodied voice possessing characters at any given moment. It's a very beautiful, horrifying thing to watch. I always thought that Tony Orsler should remake this because he would do a great floating mouth. But I wanted to introduce this as sort of something that's going on in this film. Can we have the next slide? So take that idea of these floating voices, these voices that have been removed from the past, voices that are lost, displaced, out there in the atmosphere, looking for a place to land. In a lot of ways, these artists, that's what their voice is. Their voice is waiting for recovery. Their voice is waiting to be revived. Their voice is waiting to possess a person that is going to give them an afterlife in their work. That's exactly what Polska's doing, but she adds an element to it that gives it a little bit of an edge. So not only is she reviving the voices, the individual voices of these Polish and other figures that are lost in art, but she's also recreating artwork in their entirety. These sets are the sets in the film are artworks that have been recreated. So Polska's version of possession in this film is based on mimicry, it's based on imitation, it's based on recreating a physical form, it's based on taking a voice and internalizing it and repeating it. The film in and of itself, you land in the film inside of a work of art. At the very beginning of the movie, you see this image at the bottom here of flotsam, or wreckage off the coast of the island. And sort of doing due diligence, I was like, well, you know, if you're going to use a fancy word like flotsam, you should know what it means. So I looked at the definition of flotsam, and it's incredibly poetic that the word flotsam appears here, because flotsam is defined on one hand as the wreckage of a ship that has crashed, but its sub-definition is a person that has been discarded. So a homeless person who is disregarded by society could be accurately described using the adjective flotsam, as horrifying as that sounds. And so at the beginning of the film, we have multiple forms of flotsam. We have the literal wreckage, which could be read as the found ship of Bas van Ader that went missing in 1975, or this wreckage could stand in for the characters themselves. Charlotte and Jersey begin the film by finding Bas van Ader, who is still alive on this rock. And so this is the first act of recreation. This is the first artwork that's being recreated, the 1975 piece, Search for the Miraculous. This, in a lot of ways, is the fulfillment of Bas van Ader's ill-fated journey. I may be making this too complicated, but I also, as I move forward, I also want to entertain another influence that's a little bit harder to see. As I went through this, of course, I recognized a lot of the artwork, whether they were by Richard Long or by Smithson. There's a lot of sacred touchstones that arise in this journey through the island. But at the same time, something else is going on, and I want to make sure that that's present as I'm talking about it. Polska shoots her film in a very specific way and in a very specific tradition. And I think that tradition is very important. And I consider that tradition to be the auteur cinema of the 60s and 70s. Specifically characters like Bergman, Antonioni, Bertolucci, Tarkovsky, the Russian. And as we move through these images, I would like you to at least have those films in the back of your mind as sort of as sort of an understated influence that's going on underneath the story that we're talking about on top. When I'm looking at the view that Charlotte on the left and Jerzy have of Jas van Ader, this is the view in a lot of ways that they never had in La Aventura. In La Aventura, they are looking for someone who is lost and end up in total alienation, not finding it. The sets are too close not to bring it up, and hopefully this will collect as we go through. Can we have the next slide? Again, here, this is Jerzy, and he asked the viewer to come with him on the path of Richard Long. The Richard Long piece you probably recognize from 1967, A Line Made by Walking. Richard Long was a character who was also a little disenfranchised by the art world, a little bit lost in sort of the gallery system. And so, he was one of the people that took to the countryside, took to making earthwork. And so he would make these projects that basically evaporated as soon as they were finished. This one is a line that he walked over and over again in a field, back and forth, until it made enough of a mark that could be registered in a documentary photograph. But here again, like the search for the miraculous, and like we'll continue to see, this is a revival. This is the idea of an artwork in the past being imitated and therefore being internalized by the filmmaker. She's going through her own journey here in taking on these voices. The visual cue here took me directly to Stalker, Tarkovsky's great film from the 70s. The most boring film you will ever watch, but completely worth it. I want to bracket that and leave you with that image of Stalker just briefly. Can we have the next slide? Sort of one of the climaxes of Polska's video as a whole is the revival of a piece I didn't know about from 1972. It's by an artist named Evita Geva, and it's called Landscape Experiment No. 2. This is a spectacular work of art. He takes reams and crates and massive amounts of books and turns them into compost in the middle of a field. And so this artwork becomes one of the first obstacles in an absolutely insanely cool moment. They come upon Paul Thek in the middle of the field, drowning in these composted books. And if you know anything about the life of Paul Thek, what a beautiful metaphor for the type of trouble and the type of burdens that he took on in his life. And when they find Paul Thek, he has no understanding of time. He doesn't know how long he's been there. He doesn't know how long he's going to be there. This is when the film really starts to separate from any sort of bucolic vision, any sort of happy view of art and art making, and is really turning sinister. Have the next slide. Similar thing happens here when the artists in their journey encounter Robert Smithson's Buried Shed from 1970, which he buried at Kent State. A very interesting aspect of the film is that while the previous work we saw by Evita Geva was a burden, was an obstacle, this is actually something that is going to save our party of artists as they're walking across the island. Shortly after Jerzy gives his reflection, the other artists emerge from the shed with the idea that they have spent the night there. Could we have the next slide? As they continue forward, this is complete speculation on my part. I've heard no other commentator in this film make this reference. But there's a point in the film where Paul Thek and Jersey are making their way up this very steep mountain, and at every turn they're sliding into this very loose dirt. To me, it looked like two things, and I couldn't get either one out of my mind. The first one was, again, Smithson's Asphalt Pour from the 70s. But more importantly to me, Roberto Rossellini's great film, Stromboli, where Ingrid Bergman, completely frustrated and fleeing her life on an Italian island, is making her way up, for better or for worse, up a volcano that is exploding. She would rather go towards the lava than stay where she's at. Even though I doubt Polska was thinking of this, I couldn't help but bring Stromboli into the lecture. After the next. The final piece in the video is an artwork that's very familiar to us here in Los Angeles. Ed Keenholts' Backseat Dodge. This, for me, is the climax of the video. This is something where the conundrums and the paradoxes of each of these artists' particular life comes to a crescendo. Because collectively, they have to make a decision here. They have to make the choice of leaving the Backseat Dodge alone in its integrity as an artwork, leaving the chicken wire couple having sex in the back as they are supposed to stay in Keenholts' original piece, or to save their lives and use the car as shelter for the night, which means that they'll have to deface this artwork. They'll have to rip the couple out in order to live. And so this is really what the video is all about. It's really about these moments where art comes up against life in a way where both are distasteful options. And you have to make one choice or the other. Each of these artists in their life made that choice, and each of them chose to leave art entirely. Before we move on, the visual the sort of sidebar here for me is Antonioni's absolutely fantastic Red Desert. If you haven't seen it, got to see it. Anyway, I want to present a still from Red Desert to again reiterate some of Polska's obvious influences underneath the more overt references. Can we have them? When they came to that Keenholts car and they ripped that artwork apart to live, my mind went kind of crazy. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to take it on. Polska being possessed enough to deface an artwork was something that I couldn't quite wrap my head around. And also, up to this point, you know, I've presented all those films, whether it's Stromboli or Red Desert or La Aventura or Wings of Desire, and I finally said, enough. This reference is not buried anymore. There is something so familiar about this place that these artists are at. And then I thought about absolutely one of my favorite movies, given enough, see it if you want, but Through the Glass Darkly by Ingmar Bergman. So I looked up an essay, Criterion's essay on Ingmar Bergman, and I started to unpack it a little bit, and I discovered that I was right. Polska is filming this video on the island, the same island that Through the Glass Darkly was filmed in. But the connection went even deeper. There was something about that Keenholts gesture. There was something about the defacing of that artwork that really took me deeper here. So to give you a brief description of Through the Glass Darkly, in this absolutely horrifying film, you observe the family that is taking a summer vacation on an island. The daughter in the family is going insane. They're all trying to deal with it. It's the elephant in the room. No one knows how to handle the daughter who is slowly spiraling out of control. The only person that knows how to deal with the situation is her father, who's a famous writer in Sweden, and who has made the decision that, unfortunately, the gleeful decision that he is going to observe her spiraling into madness and turn it into a book. Turn it into what he considers to be the path to what will be his greatest book. And when you sort of realize this about him, it's hard not to get physically, emotionally, spiritually sick in thinking about this writer observing his daughter going mad, actually wishing for her madness to speed up because he knows how good his book will be. And when the daughter discovers that he's doing this, and she spirals even further out of control, you start to realize that everything in the film is distasteful. The writing of it, the encounter of the daughter and the father, their entire relationship is demented. And then you start to realize what is really going on at a Bergman level as a director. And when you realize what is really going on in Through the Glass Darkly, you realize that you're sharing the eyes, you're sharing the possession of both Bergman and her father. When you're viewing the camera lens and you're watching her go mad, you necessarily are implicated in that viewpoint, in that perspective. And that's when the ocean of sickness starts to unfold in that film. And when I saw the Keenholts thing, I decided that this is exactly what's going on in Polska's film. As we've followed these artists and as we've been possessed by the artist, she's slowly imitating them and implicating us in this journey. The film, in and of itself, becomes the afterlife. The representation of the afterlife becomes a moot point in relationship to what Polska's doing, which is giving them voices, bringing their voices back, bringing the artwork back, re-inhabiting these artists. That's why I mentioned that the gentleman, I have to see my key, Andres Zimsik, the guy with the books, the guy with the library, the guy with the children's coloring book, the guy that gave up that idea of originality. That's when I would become so poignantly sad that he's not on the journey, because Polska is doing exactly what he wants. She's playing out art in exactly the way that he dreamed it would play out, through imitation, through possession, through the abandonment of your own subject, and you're taking it on of other personas, anyway. So in the same way, Through the Glass Darkly finishes with that horrible implication of the viewer in the camera with Bergman, viewing that father. Thus, this film will end. The last slide. We'll end with a similar viewpoint. In the same way that the Bergman film crashes, thus Polska's film crashes as well. You view, along with the artists, an eclipse not of the sun, but of the earth. You sit there and you observe them observing the earth as it's completely going into darkness. And this is the crescendo of the piece, and this is where sort of this inhabitation, this possession becomes complete. We as viewers now completely have the eyes of the subjects of this film, both the Polish artists as well as the silent Lee Lozano, the same as the tortured Paul Tech and the lost Bas Van Otter. So it ends in a very poignant manner, a very pessimistic manner, a very uncertain manner. We've successfully revived the voices. We've successfully given these artists an afterlife, but how to proceed forward is of a great question. Maybe in the question and answer I might go into it a little bit deeper, but I think that is where we'll close.